thanks so much for coming and spending some of your Saturday with us today. What I wanted to do first, I heard that kick in. Everybody can hear me well? Okay. What I want to do is really go over first an overview of what anxiety is. Get us all on the same page, using the same language, get a good base foundation of what anxiety is, what it's not. Talk about what some common signs and symptoms are. So what does it look like if we're trying to spot it in our children or in our classrooms? Discuss some common coping strategies or things that we can do in the classroom and at home to work on anxiety in children. And then talk about when to seek outside help and support and some of the options that are out there. We've got about an hour and a half today to be together, so my plan is to try to get through this part in about 30 minutes. So I'm going to try to get a nice foundation in about 30 minutes, and then really what I'd like to do is spend our time in question and answer. So I know that there are a range of reasons that have brought you all here today. I'd like to kind of be general with the talk part and then be able to really respond specifically to what kind of concerns or questions you may have that I may be able to be helpful, whether it's in a general sort of sense or questions based on the fact that I work as a therapist and that role and reasons you may or may not seek therapy or treatment specific to that. Okay. So, what is anxiety? And if you have a handout, the slide should follow along with that as well if you wanted to follow along. Anxiety is, right now, considered the most common mental health concern in the United States. About 1 in 10 school-age children are diagnosed with or meet criteria for an anxiety disorder. That rate rises to about 15% actually at high school age. Okay. So the prevalence in children, even just leaving adulthood out of it, the prevalence in children is great. It is absolutely the #1 mental health disorder. Studies have shown that this rate is probably an underestimate because we're talking about those folks that we can identify and that have some way, shape, or form been identified. And the likelihood is that there are many that haven't actually been identified. So when we're looking at anxiety, we're thinking, anxiety is a term I think that gets thrown around and misused. We use anxiety to talk about normal stress or normal stress reactions. When I'm talking about anxiety, what I mean is anxiety is something that goes above and beyond a normal or typical stress reaction for somebody. But what's so difficult about that is that anxiety usually comes out of a stress reaction to something that is pretty normal, pretty common, and makes a lot of sense if you really think about it, right? So fears, phobias, avoidance of different things that really make a lot of sense, but that anxiety is something that we diagnose or that we look at when it starts to impact someone's functioning. It starts to get in the way of them living well or living the fullest life that they can possibly live. It starts to stop them from doing the things that they actually want to do, right? That distress level for them is then high. So there's a difference between talking about stress, right? So that we would expect everyone in the world to at some point experience stress. We can't avoid it. It's actually quite a good thing to have at times, that stress reaction. But anxiety is when we take that stress reaction and we start to have such an overabundance of it that it truly interferes with how we live, okay? So looking at that then in kids, what generally we look at is signs like being excessively frightened by things that maybe they don't need to be, or things that they generally you would think of as a little bit of fear, that excessive piece really comes into play. Feeling distressed or uneasy in situations that's just not typical for that age range, okay? So we start to look for things that would be explained not necessarily by, does it make sense that someone would be maybe fearful here, but how much of an impact is it having on them? How much of an emotional impact, how much of a behavioral impact is that having on somebody? The fight or flight response that everyone experiences is really natural and really helpful. Anxiety is when that fight or flight response starts to happen in situations that we don't really need it. And so what it does is it directs our behavior and causes us to start doing things that we don't actually need to do or that we don't actually want to do, right? So if we're preparing for something that is actually going to do us harm, we need that charge of emotion, we need that charge of physical symptoms, and it's totally helpful and totally good, right? If someone is attacking me and I start screaming, no, 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 it is absolutely helping me. But if I don't want to go to school because I'm really, really test anxious, and mom is trying to get me in the car, and I throw my body down and I start screaming, no, 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 no. It's not necessarily equitable to the situation, right? So the cycle of stress is something I'll come back to a lot today. This to me is the most key part of understanding what anxiety is and what it's not. Anxiety is a combination of all three of these things. It's a combination of our thoughts, our behaviors, and our feelings. And the way that these go together is in a cycle. You never have one or the other without all three playing together. All three affect each other, all three diminish each other, all three increase each other, depending on what's happening. But generally, in a cycle of stress or a cycle that turns into anxiety, somebody will have cognitions or worry thoughts. So we start with the thoughts, right? Something bad is going to happen. If I go here, then I'm not sure what's going to happen to me. They all hate me, or no one likes me, right? These worry kind of thoughts. I'm not sure of myself, or I'm not sure of that. It can be any number of different things. Those worry thoughts then lead to some kind of physical change in the body. So heart rate increases, sweaty palms, maybe breathing gets faster and shallower. And it could be very dramatic, or it could be just a little bit, but there's some sort of physical change that happens because of those thoughts coming to mind. Then, because of those thoughts there, combined with the physical, right, what do you think the physical then adds back to the thoughts? Instead of it being something like, oh, interesting, the physical side of my body, right, I'm noticing that my thoughts just did that. Generally, when somebody has anxiety, what it does is, if I'm feeling this way, it must mean that my thoughts were right. There is something for me to fear because I wouldn't feel so charged up if that wasn't correct. And then it leads to behavior, which is usually avoidance in some way, shape, or form. I want to stay away from that thing. I want to stay away from that person. I want to not go to school. I want to avoid that thing, even if I have to throw a tantrum in order to avoid it. Even if I have to do this thing that looks so dramatic and you can't understand why I'm doing it, if I avoid that, that's fine because that mattered more than what this other behavioral thing was. So then what happens? Now we've got this avoidance behavior in some way, shape, or form, right? Could be small avoidance, could be really large avoidance. Like if I saw a snake over there and I want to avoid snakes, I may not be dramatic. I may just sort of casually walk over this way. It doesn't always have to be a big behavior. But then all of a sudden I've avoided. My behaviors led me to avoid the thing that I'm having some worry thoughts about. And what does that do to my worry thoughts? Does it make my worry thoughts seem logical or illogical? Logical, right? I walked away from that thing that made me afraid. You know what? I ended up being okay. So those thoughts that I had were absolutely right. So when I have those thoughts, that's reality. And when those thoughts make me feel that way, that's my body telling me, oh, yeah, you're right, that's dangerous. And then I avoid. And this cycle over time grows and grows and grows. But what's so interesting and so difficult about this cycle is that it's easy to understand when we think about a certain feared object. It's so challenging, though, to think about when it's about our own internal thoughts that we're trying to avoid, things that we're trying to distract ourselves from, because one of the behaviors that you can do is actually try to avoid thinking about the thing. That's actually a way to avoid. And that's more common. So we think about a specific phobia, walking away from this snake. That makes a lot of sense. I don't know how many of you have a child that you feel like is dealing with anxiety right now, but if you think about those avoidance types of behaviors where they're actually trying to avoid thinking even about that thing, that's more of what I'm talking about, and it's so much more common. But it still goes in with this cycle. The types of anxiety disorders that are out there, there's a large number of them. So when I gave that number about 1 in 10 school-aged kids, 15% of high school-aged kids, it's a combination of all of these types of anxiety disorders, okay? Not one specifically, but looking at the different types that are out there. We can go into these more later if anyone is interested, but things like panic disorder, which involves a general level of anxiety, but for somebody that deals then with large extreme versions of panic symptoms and then panic attacks that come along with that. So that physiological piece would be a large piece of what they deal with, almost to the point sometimes that they may not even realize the worry thoughts were there and just be so aware of the physical symptoms that come along with it, okay? Obsessive compulsive disorder, I think, is one that is fairly commonly known, but the idea that obsessive thoughts are there, so those are those worry thoughts, right? And the compulsive piece talks about the behavior in our cycle. So in our cycle that feeds on itself, the compulsive piece is the behavior of avoiding or the behavior of doing something to remedy that worry thought. Okay? So that's exactly what it is. Post-traumatic stress disorder, something that comes following a trauma to the system. Social anxiety disorder, this would be something where the worry thoughts are really specific to social situations, peer relationships, getting by in a variety of social situations. Specific phobias, like I referred to, the idea of a snake or something that's really a certain and specific feared object. And then generalized anxiety disorder, which is when someone experiences a number of different types of worry thoughts, but that those worry thoughts are present and a part of their daily routine in their daily life often. But what they notice, as opposed to panic disorder, is less maybe of the physicality that comes with it, and they're much more in tune and aware of the number of the worry thoughts that come to mind, so that those kind of keep coming and coming and coming. Okay? When we talk about the causes of anxiety disorders, there's no one cause. And for any one individual, we could never possibly say, this is what caused anxiety for you. But there are three sort of areas that contribute for most people. The first is genetics. So the way genetics influence anxiety is that genetics make you susceptible to or vulnerable to anxiety. Like any number of other things, depression included, people are more or less likely to be susceptible to develop anxiety or that worry type of thought based on their genetic predisposition. So that's one way it plays in. Another way it plays in is that children who have parents that are anxious are 7 times more likely to be anxious themselves. Okay? Now, that's not all genetics. There's no way it is. We think it's probably about 30 to 40% genetics, that link. But there's genetics involved in there somewhere. Okay? So genetically, we have a predisposition. It doesn't mean that if you don't have that anxiety gene that you can't develop it, and it doesn't mean that if you do, you're automatically going to. But there's a vulnerability piece with genetics. The next piece is learning and modeling. So parents, teachers, role models, peers, right? At different ages, each of those people matter more, too. I'm sure you can imagine when peers matter more versus parents, but how we watch people around us deal with things, and not just necessarily how we watch, oh, this person, my mom is fearful of that, and so I automatically take that in. More in an abstract way, we watch how our role models deal with fear, we watch how they cope, we watch how they address things that make them distressed, we watch the variety of coping styles that they use, and we watch how they talk to us about our fears. And then last is environmental. So things outside of our relationships and outside of ourselves, but things that we can be exposed to. For example, trauma. So in PTSD, there has to be some environmental exposure to a trauma. That would apply here. There's also been recent studies by the National Institute of Mental Health that found the number of kids that developed obsessive compulsive disorder following exposure to strep bacteria was high, and that there was some link there. So by no means do all children who have obsessive compulsive disorder have some link to the strep bacteria, but there has been some link found there to severe infection and then an onset of anxiety symptoms, so that there is some type of influence on the body system there. So there's a number of different things, and generally when someone would come into my office, what I would be looking at is I'd be looking at what's the combination of these 3 things that likely is influencing this person, and not in a so that we can put blame on something, but so that we can understand and then move forward in a helpful way. So if there's a modeling situation, right? So let's say the person's models are really enacting for them a lot of anxiety style of coping, then that's going to be much more important than if we consider if they've had a recent strep infection and we possibly need to remedy and look further medically. So how do you spot it? when you're not thinking about yourself, but you're looking, when you're looking at your children, you're looking at groups, you're looking at a classroom, how do you spot it? There are 4 main categories, generally, that we think of as symptoms or things that you can notice, either that change about somebody or that look like they are dealing with in a different way than their same age peers. And that's really, really crucial and critical here. What my expectation would be, right, for somebody that's 3 or 4 is going to be dramatically different for 9 or 10. So all of these are, really in the context of someone's age. But think about emotional symptoms, cognitive symptoms, behavioral symptoms, and physical symptoms. So emotionally, you may notice low self-confidence, so talking negatively about yourself, not being as sure of yourself as previously. Hypersensitivity. So this one I often get questions about, well, how does that sound like anxiety when somebody's hypersensitive? So they're really irritable, they're quick to jump, they're quick to temper, right? Why is my kid exploding at me all of a sudden? And I say, well, they're anxious, and it didn't seem like that on the surface. The reason is, think about if you're in that cycle. You're constantly cycling internally, right? It's not usually overt, it's not usually external, it's usually internal. You're thinking constantly and constantly and constantly. Your motor is always running. You're always worrying. You're always thinking about avoiding. You're always thinking about preventing. You're always thinking about what's coming next. You're monitoring physical symptoms. You're trying to keep other people from noticing them. That's exhausting. So the little thing that you say that then gets an explosive kind of reaction isn't because that person started at a baseline of 2 or 3 and they were nice and calm. Maybe internally they were already worn out and charged up to a 7 or an 8. So looking for hypersensitivity and that mood lability, so quickness to change, quickness to temper, sudden mood changes, all of those things can actually tell us that there may be anxiety underlying. Easily distressed and agitated. We're looking at cognitive symptoms, or those worry kind of thoughts. The idea of a need to be perfect, critical self-thinking. Those sometimes are hard to spot as well initially until things maybe progress or maybe even get more severe. Often a child who worries about being perfect will not be somebody who comes into, let's say, my office pretty quickly. Because in school they worry about doing well on their tests, they're worrying about doing their homework, they're worrying about pleasing their parents, they're worried about pleasing other people in their life. And until it's noticeably taking a toll on them, actually, they usually get credit for doing what they're doing. It usually gets fed into by people in their life, and not in a bad way, but just, yeah, you're self-motivated, this all looks good. It's when it shifts into not being able to tolerate imperfection, right? I want you to strive to do well, and I want you to be motivated, not just because I want you to be, but it's when you can't not be perfect that we're talking about it being different. So words like that, having to re-erase homework that's written well and written fine, but having to do it repetitively because it's not perfect looks more like anxiety, right? That critical self-thinking, so having negative self-thoughts, being overly critical of oneself, worrying too much about what other people think. Behaviorally, so difficulty concentrating. This is another big one that I think often gets missed early on, is because it looks like something else. It looks to, a lot of time in the classroom, I think it looks like an attention deficit. I think at home, a lot of the time, it looks like a lack of motivation. But usually, if there's an anxiety underlying it, it's because someone is so focused on the internal feelings and thoughts that they're trying to control, that they don't have the ability to spread themselves out to all the places that they need to focus. Comparing self to others, crying, frustration, anger at self, anger at others, things that are kind of coming out of nowhere, being overly responsible, being overly people-pleasing. These are all sort of signs that there may be a cycle like that going on internally. In terms of physical, headaches, nausea, excessive sweating, shortness of breath, rapid heart rate, lightheadedness, but also things like disruption of normal routine, excessive amounts of time on the parent's part trying to coax the kid into doing what they normally do or what they need to be doing. The things that usually work to console or make them feel better, not working anymore. More temper tantrums than they used to have. avoiding school, trying not to go to school or trying to avoid certain days of school. Those sorts of things would be signs or symptoms. At school, as I move into sort of talking about what we can do, at school there are a lot of common accommodations, and we can go through these more in depth if anybody's interested, but some of the things that we often will talk about are things like seating within the classroom, so whether being seated in the front or towards the rear of the classroom may be helpful for a child. Actually, and I should back up and say, accommodations here, my goal wouldn't be necessarily to help a child avoid things that are feared, but instead would be to help them move in a direction where they grow well, so that we would slowly move them in a direction of confidence and ability to tackle the things that are worrisome, but not that we would build an environment that would allow them to avoid all things of fear. But the school environment can be really, really helpful in building self-confidence and in moving in a positive direction. So sometimes we'll include some of these things in a plan. Class participation and answering in front of the class can sometimes be things we'll look at. So being called on out of turn, and if that draws anxiety or creates an anxious reaction and then interferes with ability to focus or concentrate or get out of the school day, what's needed. Testing conditions. So a lot of times we'll talk about maybe a child who's in the middle of a test and gets anxious as soon as they hear someone else get up to turn in their test or just be done with their test, so they start moving around. So they're fearful or anxious of the fact that they weren't the first to be done, or that they need to hurry because they're still in the middle of their test. So sometimes testing conditions like moving to a separate location where you don't have to worry or think about how long it took anyone else, those types of things can be helpful. Making plans for unstructured activity times can be really, really critical. Instead of unstructured times feeling good for most anxious kids, those are times that are the hardest at school. So lunchroom time, recess time, and unstructured play time in the classroom can actually provoke anxious reactions most easily, because there's not a plan for how to do that, or what to do, or where to go, or who to be, and those worry thoughts can become large quickly. And so making plans for those kind of times, learning skills to deal with those kind of times, maybe having a safe person in the school that they can go to, and any number of other plans that we can make in advance. So in thinking about other forms of treatment, when to get professional help is a question that I get often. So, my child is dealing with this. Is it time that I seek out someone like you? What would be helpful? What could we benefit from? Where would that go? Anxiety is not considered really a disorder based on what the child is worrying about, but rather how much the worry is controlling the child. So generally, we make that kind of decision based on how much control the anxiety or worry has over the child's life at that point. If a child is avoiding things that they used to enjoy, if they're avoiding normal routine family functions, if the anxiety is interfering with the things that they love doing or should love doing, we may talk about getting other intervention like therapy. Also, if anxiety is no longer protecting them, but is instead harming them. So where I talked about stress, right? Our normal stress reaction can be quite helpful. It can tell us when situations aren't good for us. So I don't expect a child that's going through different transitions to necessarily be stress-free and need to run into a therapist's office. But when it's no longer protective, then seeking out advice, support, and treatment is generally warranted and helpful. There are two main types of treatment options available: therapy and medication. In terms of medication, I'll just touch base on that briefly. There are a number of different medications out there, and generally how medication is used for anxiety specifically is as a treatment tool in conjunction with therapy. And the reason for that is that medication for anxiety doesn't actually eliminate the cause or the source of anxiety. But what it can do, and where it can be extremely helpful, is that it can help to remedy and lower or reduce the physical symptoms of anxiety. It can help to reduce some of the worry thoughts that go along with anxiety. So that when somebody is seeking out other forms of treatment or support, the combination of medication included can help make them more successful at practicing new coping skills, can make them more successful at the other things that they're trying to do, so that they can build not only on self-confidence and self-esteem, that they can see the benefit of the new way of doing it and have time to practice and rehearse that. So medication can be really helpful in that way. In terms of therapy, there are a number of different types of therapy out there. Cognitive behavioral therapy is used often with children so that we can work on both the cognitive piece, so the worry thoughts, as well as the behaviors that are sustaining that cycle that they've got going. Okay? What can parents do at home? There's a lot. First is recognizing it. So if you suspect that anxiety may be something that's going on in your home, recognizing it first and foremost is the most important thing you can do. Couple tips that I have. The calmer you stay when you discuss anxiety with your child or you discuss their thoughts, the better. You can either add energy to that cycle that they already have going, or you can take energy out of it. No matter what they say, it can freak you out. No matter what they say, your mind can go in a million different directions of questions you want to ask or emotions that it brings to the surface to hear what they're struggling with. The calmer you stay, the more likely you are to draw energy out of that cycle, as well as to understand the fullness of what is actually going on for them internally. One thing I like to talk about is red light and green light thoughts with kids, and this is really, really great even with little ones. The idea of helping them to label and identify thoughts as green light thoughts, the kind of thoughts that keep you going, and red light thoughts, the kind of thoughts that stop you in your tracks. So is that a red light thought or is that a green light thought? And if it's a red light thought and you agree it's not one that really should be one, you help them figure out a way to change it into a green light thought. So I shouldn't go to school today is a red light thought, right? And how do we turn that then into a green light thought? Planning for transitions. So I don't know many kids who love and get excited about transitions of any kind, right? Most aren't huge fans, but the more you plan for them, especially with a kid who has any type of anxiety, the better. But key to that is that you don't necessarily have to know that your child struggles with transitions to do this. So even a child who doesn't tell you or show signs that they struggle with transitions generally will benefit from that anyways. So pre-planning for the big life transitions, but even small ones with warning when you're about to move from one activity to another. Or if you're going somewhere new that you haven't gone before, discussing with and pre-planning for what it might be like and giving room for all the questions that could come along with what might I expect while I'm there. Setting expectations of your child, and that at the bottom consequences kind of go together. So the idea of not necessarily amending situations so that you help them avoid things. So having expectations of them that are age appropriate of what they should do, what they should be able to do, and helping move them to that, not necessarily moving backwards so that they don't meet expectations. Building on their personal strengths and letting them do things on their own so that they can see the benefit and the pride that comes with tackling something new on their own. In terms of the modeling piece, looking at your own fears or how those fears could be passed on, looking at how you cope with things. Don't expect anybody not to be fearful of things, and don't expect anybody not to have a variety of ways of coping with that, but more is the idea of being mindful of how you do that. So the more ways you can cope with something, the better. The more variety you can add to what you're doing, the better. So that mindfulness or awareness of how am I coping with things in general? What might I be showing if I was just watching myself? Being available. So when you notice a worry thought or you hear talk of something that includes worry, making yourself available on the spot, in the moment, dropping everything else that you're doing and listening. The reason is that it's really hard for most people, especially kids, to go back to that later. So to say, what was bothering you earlier? Maybe you can describe a little bit of the situation, but if someone can tell you right there in the moment what it is that they're thinking, you're going to get such good information. You're going to know so much more about how you can help and where to go with that. So being available whenever needed is definitely something that you can do at home. Listening actively, so spending your time being a listener rather than a problem solver, trying to get as much information as possible rather than closing down any of those directions, but instead opening up the discussion to just go whatever direction your child takes you. Considering what types of stress reducers the family at large is using. So looking at the family as a whole and including your child in new ways to cope and new ways to stress reduce, but using some of that information as a data point that we maybe can do some new things, and then seeking additional help if needed. A couple of my favorite coping strategies that I want to leave you with. These are things that we sometimes will use in therapy, and they're great at home techniques and strategies to use. They're great on the spot because they can help somebody to interrupt that cycle of anxiety or stress. So the first one is bubble breaths, and there are two different ways to do this. But what the goal of bubble breaths is to slow down physiologically. So if I slow someone down physiologically, am I going to end the worry cycle for them? No, not a chance. But if I slow down one part of that cycle, I have a much better chance. And if I slow down one part of that cycle, I have a much better chance that it's just not going to get worse from there as well. So bubble breaths. The first way, there are two ways to do bubble breaths. The first way is to fill your cheeks like they're filled with air, like big bubbles themselves. Yes, everybody do that. I already saw a couple. Good. Now, keep the air filled in your cheeks. Oh yeah, totally class participation. Everybody's at it. Yes? Yes. It's silly. It feels funny. Now breathe in and out of your nose. Keep your cheeks filled. Don't let the bubbles go. You got to keep them. Yes. Good. It's hard at first, right? You want to give up on it because now slow it as much as you can. Maybe even the point that you can breathe in and out for 5 seconds each. And do everything you can. Just keep breathing in and out of your nose. And try not to give in to that sense of wanting to let your cheeks go. Good work. It's kind of silly. That helps, right? Because that's going to interrupt those worry thoughts instantly. But what it does for most kids is it helps them to do something that they can't normally do. If you say breathe deeply or breathe slowly, most will go, or go, and they'll stay right up here in the top of their chest, right? Bubble breaths don't always get you to go deeply, but they will get you to slow because they force you to do that, and it makes a little bit of a game out of it. So that's one way. The second bubble breaths version is you take a nice deep breath in and you pretend you're blowing bubbles. So you dip your wand. Okay, and you do that a couple times. So either one of those are great. Rainbow breaths is another one. This ties in breathing, but it's also a whole body physiological. You are going to picture the colors of the rainbow, okay, moving up your body. So you're going to start down at your toes with purple, and it's going to go purple, blue, green, yellow, orange, red, okay? And as you move, what I want you to do is breathe slowly in through your nose and picture pulling all the colors of the rainbow all the way up your body to your head. And then as you exhale slowly, picture them melting back down your body. If I ask a kid to do this, I usually have them sit comfortably, close their eyes. And if you do a cycle of 3 to 5 of those, what happens is you're not only breathing slowly and deeply, but it takes you some time, because if you get to yellow and you're done with your breath, you realize you didn't take a long enough breath. And so it forces you to start drawing longer breaths in and longer breaths out. So those are all ways that you can teach deep breathing. Learning how to take a break, an appropriate break, incorporating that as a coping strategy. 5-finger exercise is something you can look it up online. It's a mindfulness technique, but it allows somebody to practice ways to relax where they do this with their fingers and they think kind, positive thoughts while they do this. And when they practice this daily, what will happen is this will cue muscle memory. So I feel this physicality happening and it's not comfortable and I do not like it at all, so I know I can go here, and all of a sudden I'm tapped into and aware of my body and I'm trying to do something to change it, so I'm interrupting that cycle. You notice most of these that I'm talking about are touching in that physical side, but for me it's the first step. We can interrupt that little bit of the physical, and then we have a little bit better control over what our behavior is, so maybe we can march into that thing we were going to avoid, or we have a little bit better control over our thoughts, right? So, all right, I'm aware right now of what I'm thinking, and I'm going to try to not let it get the best of me. Progressive muscle relaxation is another thing. You can find great scripts online. It's something you tense and release the muscles of the body from head to toe, one at a time, and you can find great scripts online where somebody will actually lead you through a progressive muscle relaxation. This is something that's used for kids, but really all the way through adulthood, and it's one of the leading exercises for relaxation out there. Making a list of the things that are not only worrying you, but making a list of all of the things that have worked for you in the past can be a great coping strategy for kids. It's something that's great to do in an interactive way, if possible. So when they feel like there's nothing that's going right, or you feel like there's no way that they could solve that, you try to find one exception. And then you build on that and make a list of the things that have gone right before. And then distracting yourself, right? So that sounds like avoidance, but actually what I mean by distracting yourself is getting away from it long enough to stop the cycle from building so that you don't have it turn into an inevitable large-scale kind of problem. A couple resources, and this is all on the handout too, so you can go back to these. We've got the NAMI website there at the top, yay. The National Institute of Mental Health, worrywisekids.org has some great at-home tips and techniques, as well as the American Psychological Association is there as well. I also have 2 handouts that I printed out that are over on the table, sort of at the end on the left there, about generalized anxiety, and then one just about worry techniques at home. So with that, I wanted to open up to questions.
We're going to stop the podcast.
And not bad, 35.
You did awesome.